describe me the thing that I need to buy that services that need. That could be, because of all the factors I've described that paddock, that's going to be my winter feed paddock. I can push a bit higher on the potential for sugars in that because I'm going to be going at a low sugar time. The paddock up the road, completely different. I want a completely different product, and so I think that's a very important point you raise.
Just a little bit from left field, but you touched on white clover before. Is there any work being done in having pastures more self-sufficient in production of their own nitrogen so we can get away from using so much nitrogen?
Yeah. I think we have a range of legumes such as white clover, lucerne, that are very good at the nitrogen fixing angle. So there is work around better rhizobia and better matching of rhizobia, and also plants which better utilise the native rhizobia. So there's a lot of thoughts in that space, but I guess there's also work around saying, how do we keep these things in pasture, and how do we get to the point that people will choose to move to having that more complex system going with the biological nitrogen versus bag nitrogen. And so that was one of the reasons we looked at doing some of this work in white clover to say, how do we fix some of those limitations it has? Because it is a very good nitrogen fixer. It's a very good plant, and the ones that got to the top in terms of the mixed pasture systems tended to get there for good reason. So there's a good reason why white clover's there, there's a good reason why subclover's there. They just have some issues. So, yep, it is an area that's being worked upon. And I think I come back to part of the issue is that we're not actually describing the value of the clover in the pasture system as well as we once did. And so again, if you're going to try and sell something or try and buy something and buy a mixed pasture, I don't think I've seen in recent times a brochure that says this clover in this mix is going, this is the nitrogen it's going to give in that blend on farm in this environment. If you just purely go on yields of clover and simplicity of management angles, you're going to end up in the ryegrass system every time. So I think it comes back a lot to saying, what do we want, why do we want it, and describing those values more accurately. And they're there, we just don't always describe them.
Kevin, just almost touching on the same subject, my dream ryegrass plant would have a lot higher genetic predisposition towards chlorophyll synthesis. Is there any work going on with increasing chlorophyll content of plants?
None that I know of. There was work done in the UK some years ago showing that there is a genetic element to chlorophyll concentration. I don't know of any work where people are actively adjusting it.
On that, there's definitely managerial aspects in there, Les, which is part of the problem. And I just want to finish off on the clover issue. One of the reasons that mosaic virus and getting the genetic, and that's a fair way down the track. That's one of the best things with it in terms of its ability to be released soon. 59% yield increase. Oh, sorry, that's the decrease. Sorry, it's the damage caused by the mosaic virus at present. That ability to make that clover more active will increase its ability to compete in the sward. So not only will it actually increase yield straight up, it'll increase its leaf area, and it'll also increase its ability to actually then compete in a ryegrass-based sward. Now, white clover will never match ryegrass in terms of kilos of dry matter, but the one thing that white clover does have, and it goes back to your question's nutrition aspect, is it's very narrow in its band of nutrition characteristics, I guess. Much less variable than ryegrass. So if we can actually have something like that taken out, it brings that white clover percentage back into the pasture sward as being more predictable, more stable. It then by default means it'll actually contribute nitrogen on a more predictable and more stable basis, which again helps with the quality aspect, stops that peaking and dropping that we get with the ryegrass pastures. So, there's a very real possibility of that coming into practicality now. Sorry, the question.
My question follows on pretty much from that, in that with the clovers, one of the problems we had with it was bloat and that sort of thing, and there was work being done on the tannin levels and things. Can you tell us a little bit about where that's at?
A number of groups have been working on trying to develop ways to improve the condensed tannin level of white clover. It's been an area of science that different groups have tried different genes, different technologies, but I've recently heard that there are some very, very promising results coming out of New Zealand with a particular gene from another clover species, and it does appear at this stage that that's some of the most promising work I've seen in that area, and I believe that they're looking at field trialling of that material quite soon. So it's the holy grail, if you like. What we have learned over the last years much more is what kind of tannin levels we should target. What we have found is that, without boring you with too much science, is that the tannin pathway is a very, very tricky one, and there's a lot of genes that look very similar that do quite different things. So they branch off and cause colour and other things. So some of the work that we were involved with in DPI in Victoria, we produced white clover with very nice pink flowers, and we did a lot of genes. So we found out a lot of the early targets which were out there in the literature were actually the forms of the genes involved in the colour formation, not the tannin formation. But as I said, I'm not 100% familiar with the work, but I believe there's been a very exciting breakthrough in New Zealand.
What do we need to be doing now that we could do to the current systems to start preparing ourselves for maximising these opportunities when they come along? And secondly, when they do come along, how do we make sure that we become handymen and not fools?
Yep. I think the key thing I would say in terms of doing now to be ready, I think, is understanding what I could loosely term the profit drivers in your system, so that when something new comes along, you're asking the right questions of it. How is it going to affect this or that? That could be that the specific trait that's targeted is one that's causing you grief, whether that's a quality trait or other, or it could be saying, how much can I trade off that advance if I've got to pay for it? So if I had to pay for high quality with persistence, how much persistence would I pay? What price, and losing a year of persistence for that quality? I think that we're getting close to the point now where we could run those scenarios, either producers themselves or with their consultants or advisors, to say, what price would you pay? We have to be honest, in all genetics, you often don't get something for nothing. There's normally some kind of balancing act in there. I guess the other thing about that is that you start then to be in a very strong position to tell breeders and geneticists, target this. I mean, I presented 3 examples. There's probably another 20 traits I could talk about in the pipeline in just the Dairy Futures CRC work, let alone the work that's happening at AgResearch in New Zealand targeting dairy pastures as well, or work that's happening in the United States. The world for delivering these tools is a multinational kind of world. The companies that operate here in Australia are largely companies who have links overseas. So we can assume that all that technology could find its way here. So I think one of the challenges is saying to those research investors, and you all do have voices, you have people with the networks, and I can tell you, as I said, it's part of my role within Dairy Futures CRC, will be helping to say, what's the next cab off the rank? What's the next thing to do? So I think that's the flip side of those 2 things, because we might have some things in the pipeline that we can kill early. And that research investors like that because they can focus on something else rather than say, well, let's keep trying to make this work. I think that the next part in terms of using the tools effectively once they've come, the first one's more about getting the right tools. The second is about using them effectively. And there, I think, again, the challenge for us is understanding our farming systems better so that we can ask the right questions of those technologies earlier to get an idea of their sensitivities. I mean, I'll use an example. In ryegrass, you know, everyone more or less understands grazing at leaf stage. But if you had a high fructan ryegrass, does that change those leaf stage rules? Does it make them more sensitive so that if you graze it a bit harder, the whole thing falls over and the plant doesn't acute? Those kind of things, I think getting that understanding and making sure that the right research questions are asked, either before you get it or you do the right questions in your own trialling and your own evaluation to say, okay, this is understanding one level, the strategic decision is I'm going to say that. The tactical part is, well, how do I now have to manage that to allow it to do what it needs? And is that more sensitive to it than the other things? So I reckon it's just being ready for that part, Rick, that is around saying some of our existing rules may need to be modified. And, you know, clover's a good example. If we did have clover that had the potential to increase its yield, let's dilute those figures by 25, 30%. That would change the way a mixed pasture dynamics would happen.